They tried to erase this story from history. They thought fire could burn it, time could bury it, and silence could choke it into oblivion. But the truth, like blood, has a way of seeping back to the surface. In the autumn of 1798, 17 travelers vanished on a 20-mile stretch of the Wilderness Road in Kentucky. No witnesses, no tracks. Just abandoned horses and personal belongings, as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. For 2 centuries, their fate was nothing but a whisper, a ghost story for the desperate and drunk. What the records reveal, what was hidden under lock and key for over 180 years, was not just murder. It was something darker, something calculated. A family who built their wealth, their reputation, and their power on blood. And they did it while praying over their victims. You were never meant to hear this. What happened on that farm wasn't a random act of violence. It was an operation, systematic, deliberate, perfected. And the men who ruled early Kentucky, judges, ministers, militia captains, knew about it. Some even feasted at the same table. This is the story of the Hardins, the family of God-fearing killers who turned southern Kentucky into their personal slaughterhouse. The Hardins weren't born killers, at least that's what the church records claim. Their lineage begins with Elias Hardin, a man described as pious and God-fearing, who arrived in Kentucky in 1782 with nothing but a rifle and a Bible. But beneath that mask of faith, there was something colder, something feral. Neighbors whispered that Elias had the devil's eyes, that he could charm a man with a smile, then gut him like a hog before sundown. His sons inherited not just his farm, but his philosophy, that the world belonged to those willing to take it. By 1795, the Hardin homestead wasn't just a farm. It was a trap. Hidden cellars, soundproofed rooms, and long stretches of fence designed not to keep livestock in, but to keep travelers from leaving. The Wilderness Road was a lifeline for settlers moving west, and the Hardins saw opportunity. Strangers meant no one to ask questions when they didn't return. It started small. A single peddler, his wagon robbed by outlaws. Then a family on their way to Missouri, never seen again. By the time 1798 came, the Hardins had perfected their methods. They offered food, shelter, and prayer to the weary. They made their guests feel safe. And when the lights went out, they slaughtered them, taking everything: money, weapons, even the clothes off their backs. But what made the Hardins different from simple bandits was what they did with the bodies. They didn't bury them. They didn't burn them. They used them. Whispers in old court transcripts, half burned, half forgotten, speak of rituals, of hymns sung over the dying, of blood collected in jars, and of sermons delivered while the victims choked on their last breath. The Hardins believed they were chosen by God to purify the road of unbelievers. And the local church? It turned a blind eye. After all, the Hardins were their biggest donors. The disappearances grew too frequent to ignore, but the truth stayed buried, locked in church ledgers and sealed testimonies, until one man saw too much and lived to tell it. The man's name was Thomas Reeve, a drifter, a war veteran, and by all accounts a man who trusted no one. In the winter of 1799, he stumbled upon the Hardin homestead, hungry, bleeding from a wound on his arm, and half dead from the cold. The Hardins welcomed him in with warm bread and firelight. Their matriarch, Martha Hardin, treated his wound with a strange, bitter-smelling ointment. He thought it was kindness. It wasn't. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. Years of battle had taught him that safety was an illusion, and the Hardins smiled too much. Their house was quiet. Too quiet. From his cot, he heard low murmurs through the floorboards, the sound of voices chanting, then a wet scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across wood. He crept out of bed and followed the sound to a trapdoor in the kitchen. What he saw beneath that house would haunt him until his dying breath. There were bodies, 5 of them, maybe 6, laid out on the dirt floor, stripped of everything but their terror. A man with his throat cut, a young woman whose hair had been braided as if for Sunday service, a child no older than 10 with eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Around them, the Hardins knelt in a circle, their hands soaked in blood, murmuring prayers that sounded less like worship and more like a bargain. Thomas didn't wait. He ran. By sunrise, he reached the nearest settlement, his voice cracking as he told the townsfolk what he'd seen. But when they rode back to the Hardin homestead, the evidence was gone. The floor was clean. The bodies were gone. The Hardins, calm as ever, claimed Thomas was mad from the war, a broken man, haunted by visions. The sheriff, paid off or simply afraid, dismissed the claim. But Thomas wouldn't let it die. He carved his story into wood, leaving behind crude symbols and warnings in places no one could erase. He knew the Hardins would come for him, and they did. 2 weeks later, his body was found hanging from a tree, his tongue missing, his skin marked with strange, deliberate cuts. The message was clear. Anyone who spoke against the Hardins would meet the same fate. After Thomas Reeves' death, the Hardins did not retreat into silence. They grew bolder. The blood they spilled was no longer just a secret buried beneath floorboards. It was power. The family began to whisper of a covenant, an unholy pact said to stretch back generations, older than Kentucky itself. It was not the God of the Bible they served, but something far more ancient, something that demanded blood in exchange for prosperity and protection. Neighbors began to notice strange things around the Hardin property. The crops never failed, even when drought withered every field for miles. Their livestock multiplied unnaturally, never falling sick. Their children never cried, never laughed. They simply watched, with wide, unblinking eyes that made grown men uneasy. The family's patriarch, Elias Hardin, was seen wandering the woods at night, carrying a lantern and muttering prayers in a language no one recognized. Hunters who crossed his path said they saw symbols carved into the trees, symbols that looked burned into the bark, though no fire had touched them. By 1802, the first official disappearances began. A farmhand named Samuel Boyd vanished while delivering grain to the Hardin homestead. His horse returned alone, its eyes rolling white, its hide streaked with sweat, as if it had seen hell itself. The sheriff once again looked the other way. Those who questioned the Hardins openly found their barns mysteriously burned, their wells fouled with dead animals, their families plagued by sudden, unexplained illness. There were rumors of a room in the Hardin house that no one but the family could enter, a room said to be locked with 7 iron bolts. Children who played too close to the house claimed to hear cries coming from behind the walls, soft and pleading. The Hardins had begun holding gatherings in the dead of night. Locals spoke of seeing strange lights moving through the woods, green and red flames that flickered without smoke or heat. The wind would carry sounds like distant singing, but no words could be understood. It was during these nights that more people went missing. Travelers, beggars, and even a preacher who dared to speak out against them during Sunday service. And yet, no one stopped them. Fear gripped the region like an iron hand. The Hardins had become untouchable. By 1805, the Hardins' influence had spread far beyond their land. It was no longer a question of fear. It was control. The law, the church, even the merchants in town seemed to bend beneath their shadow. Those who lived near Hardin territory whispered that Elias Hardin could buy silence with more than gold. He could buy it with terror. The local sheriff, a man named Robert Hale, once rode out to question Elias after yet another disappearance. Witnesses claimed they saw the sheriff ride into the Hardin woods, but they never saw him ride out. Days later, he was found wandering back into town, pale and hollow-eyed, unable to speak a word. He resigned the next morning, packed his belongings, and left Kentucky for good. He never told anyone what he saw that night. The church fared no better. Reverend Whitmore, a firebrand preacher known for railing against sin, tried to condemn the Hardins from the pulpit. He called them the plague of Ashland County, declaring their gatherings to be the work of the devil. The next Sunday, his church burned to the ground while he and his family slept inside. Only charred fragments of his Bible were found. No one dared rebuild the church for years. People began to believe the Hardins were untouchable because they were chosen, not by God, but by something older, something that fed on fear and blood. Elias Hardin's children were said to have been seen speaking to people who weren't there, their small mouths murmuring to the empty air as if answering unseen voices. A new sheriff came to town, but he did not speak against the family. He dined with them. He smiled at their children. When people went missing, he dismissed the cases as travelers lost on the roads. When livestock was found mutilated, he called it wolves. Even the town's merchants became entangled in the Hardins' power. It was said that if a man refused to sell goods to the Hardins, his store would catch fire within a week. A blacksmith who defied Elias found his forge cold and dead. His tools rusted overnight as though cursed. By this point, people stopped asking questions. They stopped knocking on the Hardins' door when someone went missing. They stopped looking into the woods at night. It was as if the entire county had been placed under a spell of silence, and the Hardins thrived in that silence. In the late autumn of 1806, when the air was heavy with the smell of burning leaves and rot, a stranger rode into Ashland County. His name was never fully known. Some said he was called Jeremiah Cole, others swore he never gave it. What people remembered most was his presence, a tall, gaunt figure in a weather-beaten coat, his eyes the color of storm clouds, watching everything with quiet judgment. He was not like the other travelers who passed through. He asked questions, too many questions. He wanted to know about the missing people, about the Hardins' strange gatherings, about the church fire that no one spoke of anymore. He stayed at the inn for 3 nights, and each night the whispers grew louder. He's going to bring trouble. The Hardins noticed him immediately. Elias Hardin, who rarely left his estate, was seen riding into town one morning. He walked straight to the inn, his boots striking the wooden floor like drum beats. Witnesses claimed Elias spoke to the stranger with a voice as smooth as oil, warning him to leave Ashland County before winter's first snow. But Jeremiah Cole did not leave. That night, the moon hung low and swollen, casting pale light over the woods. Some say Jeremiah was seen near the Hardin property, lantern in hand, taking notes in a small leather-bound journal. Others claim he stood by the old well where screams had once been heard, listening. 2 days later, things began to happen. A cow's carcass was found at the edge of town, but unlike before, its remains bore strange markings, symbols carved into the hide, as if by a blade rather than animal teeth. People whispered that Jeremiah was behind it, that maybe he was the danger. The tension grew unbearable. The townsfolk, already bound by fear of the Hardins, now felt caught between 2 dark forces, the family they dared not oppose, and this stranger who would not bow to them. On the foes. Earth night, the innkeeper swore he saw Elias Hardin himself standing across the street, watching the inn, a shadow behind him that looked like something not entirely human. He did not move, did not speak, only stared until dawn broke over the horizon. By the end of that week, Jeremiah Cole vanished. His horse was found tied near the river, but his journal and belongings were gone. Some claimed Elias dealt with him. Others believed he had gone deeper into the woods, following the trail of something older and far darker than the Hardins themselves. After Jeremiah Cole's disappearance, Ashland County seemed to fall under a deeper shadow. It was as if the earth itself had grown tired of sunlight, swallowing every beam of warmth beneath a dull grey haze. People stopped speaking of the stranger. They did not ask where he went or what he found, because in Ashland, asking questions was a death wish. The Hardins grew bolder. For months, they had been content to operate in silence, whispers, symbols etched into trees, fires burning faintly behind shuttered windows. But with Jeremiah gone, it was as though nothing and no one could challenge them any more. Elias Hardin was seen more often in town, and each time the air seemed to still, as though the wind itself feared him. One evening, a farmer named Jacob Meyer claimed he saw something he could not explain. While cutting through the woods near Hardin's land, he stumbled upon a circle of stones, blackened by fire and carved with symbols that did not belong to any known language. Standing inside the circle was Elias, chanting in a voice that sounded like two men speaking at once. Jacob ran, but by the time he returned with others, the stones were cold and the circle was empty. Rumors of sacrifices resurfaced. Chickens, goats, and dogs began vanishing from farms. A child, no more than 6 years old, disappeared near the riverbank. The town searched for days, but no trace of her was ever found, except for a single ribbon snagged on a branch near the path leading to Hardin land. The reverend at the local church dared to speak against Elias during a Sunday sermon, warning the people that they were living under the shadow of evil. By Monday morning, the church bell tower had collapsed in the night. Some said it was rot, others said it was wind, but the reverend left town that same week and was never seen again. The Hardins began holding gatherings on the hill behind their estate. No one could see what happened there, but strange music, low droning notes that seemed to crawl into your skull, carried through the trees. On these nights, fires glowed from the hilltop like watchful eyes, and animals howled in terror from miles away. And yet, no one dared interfere. The town had learned one thing. When the Hardins looked at you, it was as if they already knew how and when you would die. Winter came early that year, colder and darker than anyone could remember. The rivers froze solid by November, and the wind cut like a blade through the hollow streets of Ashland County. People whispered that nature itself had turned against them, as if some ancient force was bleeding the life from the land. It was on the night of the winter solstice that the Hardins revealed how deep their power ran. From miles away, villagers saw the hilltop behind the Hardin estate ablaze with towering fires, stretching like skeletal hands into the night sky. The flames burned not yellow or orange, but a deep, unsettling crimson, like blood brought to a boil. The ground trembled faintly, as if something beneath the earth was stirring. Those who dared listen claimed to hear the chants carried on the wind. The voices were not human. They were guttural, layered, like a dozen throats speaking in unnatural harmony. The words had no meaning that any living tongue could translate, but they burrowed into the mind like insects, leaving behind a terror so deep it made the heart seize. By morning, the snow around the Hardin land was streaked with dark stains. Tracks led to the hilltop, boot prints, bare feet, and claw marks, but none led away. No one saw who attended those gatherings. No one asked. But within a day, the missing child's family packed their belongings and fled town without a word. Elias Hardin grew more confident after that night. He walked into the town square, as if he owned every soul who dared look at him. His eyes, cold, sharp, unblinking, seemed to search for something beneath your skin. People spoke of his shadow, how it moved differently, as though it was not connected to his body at all. Stranger still, some began to change. Townsfolk who had attended Hardin gatherings, though they would never admit it, returned with pale faces, glassy eyes, and vacant smiles. They spoke little, worked mechanically, and seemed to age in strange ways. One woman's hair turned white overnight. Another man's hands grew so calloused and dark they looked burnt. It was as though something had been taken from them. or something new had been placed inside. The Hardins had stopped hiding, and with each ritual, the line between the living and something far worse grew thinner. The silence broke on a moonless night. It began with a scream, one so sharp, so primal, that it carved through the frozen air like a blade. The sound came from the old miller barn on the edge of town, a place no one dared visit after dark. By the time the neighbors arrived with lanterns, the building was in flames, and the snow around it was soaked black. They found only pieces of what had been left behind. The Miller family, Thomas, his wife Abigail, and their 2 sons, were gone, their home reduced to ashes. But there were symbols carved into the barn doors, etched so deep they cut through the wood, as if made by something far stronger than human hands. The marks formed a pattern, a circle intersected by jagged lines, and in the center, the letter H was burned into the wood, still smouldering. No one spoke of what they saw inside the barn. Some said the walls were covered in handprints, too small to belong to adults. Others whispered that animal bones, no, not animal, were arranged in strange patterns across the ground. One man swore he saw something crawling in the flames, something that should not have been alive. The sheriff tried to claim it was bandits. "A traveling gang," he said, his hands trembling as he spoke. But the townspeople didn't believe him. They had seen Elias Hardin standing at the edge of the square the next morning, his coat dusted with soot, his pale face calm as ever. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. That day, no one worked their fields. No one opened their shops. The town gathered at the church, praying under locked doors, but their prayers felt hollow. Every time the wind shifted, they swore they could hear laughter, low, rasping, distant, as if the hills themselves were mocking their faith. The Hardins didn't bother to deny it. In fact, the following night, lanterns burned in every window of their estate, glowing, like watchful eyes in the dark. And from the hilltop, that same chant returned, deep, pulsating, as though it were calling something from beneath the frozen earth. The Miller barn fire was the first blood offering the Hardins made openly. It would not be the last. From that night forward, fear was no longer whispered. It was painted on every face, etched in every trembling hand. The fire changed everything. The town could no longer pretend that the Hardins were just a family of eccentric landowners. No one slept. Doors were barred, windows nailed shut, and still the wind carried that chant, low and endless, as if the night itself had learned to speak their name. The sheriff called a meeting in the church basement, but his voice cracked like dry wood. "We cannot let this continue," he said, "or none of us will be left." The men gathered around him, farmers, blacksmiths, storekeepers, hard men with calloused hands, but none of them dared to speak first. It wasn't courage they lacked. It was clarity. How do you confront something that doesn't feel human? Finally, Jacob Reed, the oldest among them, slammed his hand on the table. "The Hardins are calling something," he growled, "and if we don't end it, that fire will spread to every home in this town." There were plans made that night, plans no one would admit to later. Torches, pitchforks, rifles loaded with silver pellets, passed down from the war. But even then, there were whispers. One man claimed his brother's crops had withered overnight, the soil blackened as if poisoned. Another swore his child woke screaming, clawing at invisible hands that left bruises on her skin. "They already know what we're planning," someone muttered, and the room fell into silence. Meanwhile, the Hardins waited. No one had seen Elias Hardin in days, but strange lights flickered across their estate at night. The shadows moved wrong, twisting and elongating, as if the lanterns were casting more than light. There were sounds, too, low groans, rhythmic and unsettling, like something being born. On the third night after the fire, the townsmen gathered, armed and trembling. The moon hung low, as if watching. They moved toward the Hardin estate in silence, every step heavier than the last. But before they even reached the highs, the sound hit them, a scream not of pain, but of something ecstatic, unearthly. It came from the house, but it wasn't just one voice. It was many, hundreds, rising and falling in a pattern that clawed at the mind. The men froze. Some vomited where they stood. Others covered their ears, tears streaking their faces. It was not a sound meant for human hearing. When they finally turned back, half of them swore they saw figures watching from the tree line, too tall, too still. That night would be remembered as the night of splintered voices. The men who had gone to confront the Hardins returned. Or rather, some of them did. The rest vanished. No one saw them die, and no one found their bodies. It was as if the forest swallowed them whole, leaving only their dropped weapons and torn scraps of clothing, damp with something that was not entirely blood. The survivors stumbled back into town just before dawn, pale and broken. Their eyes told the story before their mouths could form words. Sheriff Hale was among them, his hands trembling as if with fever. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt swollen, his throat burned as though the night had branded him from the inside. Finally, in a voice that didn't sound like his own, he whispered, "We saw them. Change." No one knew what that meant. Not fully. But the survivors described figures that moved between forms. Human one moment, something else the next, as though flesh were no longer bound to bone. The Hardins stood on the balcony of their decaying manor, their faces lit by an unholy glow, chanting in a language that made the men's heads pound as if their skulls would split. One man, a farmer named Clay Rowe, claimed he saw Elias Hardin's shadow separate from his body and crawl along the ground like a living thing. The sheriff ordered everyone indoors, but fear is not something you can hide from behind a locked door. The chant returned, echoing through the streets like a sickness. Windows shook. Dogs howled until their voices cracked. Somewhere on the outskirts of town a barn door slammed open, though no wind blew. The cows were found the next morning, still standing, eyes wide and white, but stone dead. It became clear that this was no longer about the Hardins alone. Something had been unleashed. The townspeople whispered of an agreement that must have been broken, an old pact tied to the land itself. By midday, an uneasy gathering formed at the church. Jacob Reed, the last man with fire left in his eyes, stood before them. "We can't run," he said. "Whatever they've called down, it's bound here. To us, to this soil. We end it, or it ends us." But the Hardins were waiting. Their doors stood wide open, as if they had known the town would come again. And this time the house seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of that infernal chant. The Hardin estate stood at the edge of the forest, hunched and rotting like some malignant growth. As the townspeople approached, a strange pressure weighed on their chests, as if the house itself were watching, breathing, waiting. Its windows reflected nothing, not the people, not the moon, only blackness deeper than any night. Jacob Reed led the way, an axe clutched tight in his hand. The men behind him carried torches, though the flames sputtered and shrank as they neared the porch, as if an unseen force were drinking the fire out of the air. No one spoke. Even breathing felt dangerous, like the house would hear them and strike. The door creaked open without anyone touching it. Inside, the stench was overpowering, rot, mold, and something metallic, almost sweet. The walls were lined with mirrors, cracked and streaked with something that looked like dried blood. But the reflections were wrong. Jacob saw himself in the glass, but his reflection grinned. A wide, feral grin he wasn't making. "Don't look," Sheriff Hale muttered, his voice trembling. "Keep moving." The hallway stretched longer than it should have, as if space itself twisted inside the house. The floorboards pulsed faintly, like veins beneath a thin layer of wood. One of the men, Clay Rowe, stopped abruptly and screamed. His feet had sunk into the boards as though the floor were soft, alive, pulling him down. They hacked at the wood with axes until he was free, but his boots remained behind, still twitching as if something beneath was chewing on them. Then came the chanting. It was louder now, surrounding them, coming from no single place but from the house itself. The mirrors quivered, showing not their own faces, but the faces of the missing. Men who had vanished the night before, mouths sewn shut, eyes leaking black tears. "Upstairs!" Jacob barked, forcing himself forward. "End this!" The stairs groaned, it under their weight. Halfway up, the wood split open, and something pale and skeletal tried to claw its way out. A hand, maybe once human, but stretched thin like leather. Jacob swung his axe, severing it, but the stump writhed like it wanted to crawl on its own. By the time they reached the second floor, the air was thick and wet, almost unbreathable. Doors slammed one by one, as if an unseen child were playing a cruel game, and at the end of the hall, standing still and smiling, was Elias Hardin. "Welcome home," he whispered, and the walls began to bleed. The hallway buckled as if the house itself were exhaling, and the men felt the floor shift beneath their feet. Jacob Reed's torch flared, its flame growing unnaturally long and green, casting monstrous shadows along the walls. Elias Hardin stood motionless at the end of the corridor, yet the air around him rippled like heat rising off a road. "You should not have come here," Elias said, his voice both calm and hollow, as though it came from a cavern deep inside the earth. "We are the keepers. We are the lock. And you are forcing the door open." Jacob raised his axe, his jaw tightening. "Where are the missing men? What have you done?" Elias tilted his head. "We didn't take them. They came willingly, just as you have, though you don't yet understand why." A low groan rolled through the walls, and then the doors lining the hallway began to creak open on their own. Each room beyond was wrong. One revealed a forest of twisted trees dripping with what looked like black tar. Another showed a blood-red sky, with hundreds of figures walking in circles, their heads bowed as if in prayer. And in one room they saw Clay's brother, eyes wide, mouth sewn shut, pressed against the window like an insect pinned to glass. The men staggered backward, their minds rejecting what they saw. Sheriff Hale muttered a prayer under his breath, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "You're not in a house anymore," Elias said, taking a single step forward. The boards beneath him didn't creak. They pulsed, as though alive. "You're in the hollow." The sound of chanting grew louder, now joined by a guttural hum that vibrated in their chests. It wasn't coming from any human throat. Something vast was stirring beneath the floor. Jacob swung his axe, smashing the nearest mirror. Instead of breaking, the glass rippled like water, and for a brief moment he saw something staring back. A colossal eye, lidless and ancient, staring at him with a hunger that wasn't human. "Run," Elias whispered, "or give yourself to it. There is no other choice." The torches flickered violently. Behind them, the staircase they'd climbed was gone, replaced by a black void stretching downward forever. The house had sealed itself. And from somewhere below, something began to crawl up the walls, its nails clicking like teeth. The sound of claws on wood grew sharper, like bones scraping stone. The men spun around, their torches trembling in their hands. But the black void at the end of the hall gave nothing back. No shape, no hint of what approached. Only the sound, slow and deliberate, as if something massive was dragging itself closer, unseen yet everywhere. "Back!" Sheriff Hale barked, raising his rifle. But his voice cracked with fear, betraying the steel he was trying to muster. Elias Hardin did not move. He simply smiled, that thin, broken smile of a man who knew exactly how this would end. "You can't shoot it. Bullets don't wound hunger. And this thing is all hunger. The floor beneath them bulged, as though something alive was crawling just under the wooden planks. Jacob Reed gripped his axe so hard his knuckles whitened, sweat running down his face. "We make for the rooms," he hissed. "Find a way out. Anyway." They dashed to the nearest doorway, but the moment Clay Thompson stepped through, he stopped dead. He wasn't in a room anymore. He was standing in a wheat field under a dying sun, the sky bleeding orange and black. Figures in torn cloaks knelt in the distance, rocking back and forth, whispering in a language that didn't belong to this world. "Clay! Clay!" Jacob roared, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him backward into the hallway. The second they were out, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the walls. Sheriff Hale swore. "This house, it's alive. It's playing with us." "Not alive," Elias corrected. "It's awake. You've stirred it, and now it wants to feed." The chanting grew louder, vibrating through their bones. The hallway began to stretch unnaturally, like the wood was melting, pulling them further and further from the entrance. The men turned to run, but the path behind them had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of black doors, each one whispering their names. One door cracked open by itself. A pale hand, bloated and rotting, slowly reached through. Jacob swung his axe, hacking the hand off, but instead of falling, the severed limb writhed and crawled across the floor like a spider, its fingers snapping open and closed. "Move!" Jacob bellowed. "Don't stop!" The men charged forward, their breath ragged, as the entire house began to shift. Walls twisting like serpents, the floor tilting, the ceiling bleeding something thick and warm. Behind them, something huge and unseen laughed. The laughter followed them, low, guttural, like something breathing through broken glass. It wasn't just sound. It was pressure, pushing against their ribs, pressing into their minds. Sheriff Hale was the first to falter. His boots skidded on the warped floorboards as he stumbled, clutching his chest. "Don't stop!" Jacob barked, grabbing Hale by the arm, but the sheriff's face had gone grey, his eyes wide and unfocused. "It's in me," Hale rasped, his voice barely a whisper. His hand trembled as he raised his rifle, not at the thing behind them, but at his own throat. "Drop it!" Clay shouted, lunging forward. But he was too late. The rifle went off with a deafening crack, and Hale dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath his chin. For a moment, silence. Then the house reacted. The walls pulsed like veins, the floor shuddering. From Hale's blood, black tendrils snaked outward, moving like worms toward his body. Jacob didn't think. He buried his axe into the sheriff's chest, trying to sever whatever was pulling at him. The tendrils only grew thicker, writhing and coiling up the axe handle, reaching for Jacob's hands. He kicked Hale's body away, stumbling back, as the sheriff's corpse began to rise. "Run," Elias said softly, his voice too calm for the madness around them. "You can't save him. He's already theirs." The body of Sheriff Hale stood on broken legs, his head lolling to one side. His mouth opened, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was a deep, rumbling tone, layered with too many voices to count. "One has been claimed. Who is next?" The thing wearing Hale's body lurched forward, impossibly fast. Clay screamed, swinging his torch into its face, the fire catching on the black ooze that was pouring from its eyes. It burned, shrieking, clawing at its own skin as the smell of charred flesh filled the hallway. Jacob grabbed Clay and pulled him down another twisting corridor, Elias following silently. The walls were closing in now, literally bending and pressing together like the house was breathing, trying to crush them. The doors they passed began to shake violently, some cracking open just enough to reveal faces, dozens of pale, lifeless faces, pressing against the wood as though they were trapped inside. Clay stumbled. His hand shot out to steady himself on a wall, but the wall moved beneath his palm, like skin. A mouth formed where he touched, biting down hard, tearing into his hand. He howled in pain, jerking back, blood spraying. "We can't fight this!" Clay yelled, voice breaking. "We're going to die in here!" Elias stopped walking. Slowly he turned, his eyes glinting with something terrible. "No," he said. "Only those who refuse the house die. If you give yourself to it, it lets you live." Jacob's grip on his axe tightened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Elias smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Jacob's stomach knot. There was no warmth in it, only knowledge. The kind of knowledge that could break a man. "The house isn't evil," Elias said quietly, stepping closer, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "It's hungry. It always has been. It's older than this land, older than your bloodlines. It wants only one thing: acceptance." "Acceptance?" Clay barked, holding his bleeding hand, his eyes wild. "It just killed Hale. It's trying to kill us." Elias tilted his head, as if Clay's words amused him. No. It offered Hale a choice. He rejected it. The house doesn't take kindly to rejection. None of you understand. You're standing inside something alive, something that's listening. The walls trembled, a low groan echoing through the hallway. Jacob felt it vibrating in his chest, like a second heartbeat. "You brought us here to die," Jacob said, his axe still clutched tight. "You led us right into this thing's jaws." Elias shook his head slowly. "No, I brought you here to choose. You can leave if you give the house what it wants." "And what's that?" Clay demanded, his voice cracking. Elias stepped closer until his face was inches from Clay's, his eyes dark and bottomless. "Blood. Willing blood. One of you must give yourself to it, or it will take all of you." The house moaned again, louder now, as if it approved. The floor beneath them split, jagged cracks forming like an open mouth. Through the gaps, Jacob could see something writhing below, something wet and black, twisting like a nest of snakes. Clay's breathing turned frantic. "He's lying. He's just trying to—" Before he could finish, Elias's hand shot out, grabbing Clay's injured hand and shoving it toward the floor. The cracks widened, black tendrils shooting up, wrapping around Clay's arm. He screamed, trying to pull free, but they were too strong. Dragging him down inch by inch. "Fight it!" Jacob roared, swinging his axe, hacking through the tendrils. Black ichor sprayed, burning his skin where it landed, but Clay was already sinking into the floor up to his chest, his screams echoing through the twisting halls. Elias stood perfectly still, watching, a serene expression on his face. "The house has chosen," he whispered. Jacob locked eyes with Clay, who was now little more than a face, his eyes wide and pleading. For a single heartbeat, Jacob considered pulling him free. But the voice of the house filled the air, low, resonant, promising freedom. Clay vanished, swallowed whole. The floor sealed shut, as if nothing had happened. And then, silence. The doors ahead of them swung open. Beyond was a clear path, moonlight spilling across the floor like an invitation. Jacob turned to Elias, chest heaving. "You knew this would happen." Elias only smiled. "Now you understand. The house always gets what it wants." Jacob and Elias stepped out into the cold night, the house behind them shuddering one last time before settling into silence. But as Jacob looked back, he swore he saw faces in the windows, watching, waiting, hungry for the next ones who would dare to enter.